Berlin saved me. If I hadn't gone there, I would have been dead by 1977. David Bowie would say this years later. But when he first arrived in Berlin in 1976, the city looked like a grave to him. Grey buildings, divided streets, the shadow of the wall everywhere. Iggy Pop and David settled into a modest apartment in Schöneberg, two destroyed rock stars trying to live anonymously. From the bright chaos of Los Angeles to the cold silence of Berlin, bicycles instead of cocaine, museums instead of fame, just David Jones instead of the thin white duke. And at Hansa Studios, right next to the Berlin Wall, David began creating the darkest and most beautiful trilogy in music history. But this wasn't just a music-making process, this was a battle for survival. If you want to hear this story all the way through, don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button to support us. When David Bowie and Iggy Pop landed at Berlin Tegel Airport, nobody recognized them. This was the first sign of how different it was from Los Angeles. There, every step brought paparazzi, fans, attention. Here there was only silence and anonymous faces. The two men grabbed their small suitcases and took a taxi to the Schöneberg district. Corinne Schwab, Bowie's assistant, had rented a modest apartment for them at Hauptstrasse 155. 3 rooms, simple furniture, plain decoration. As Bowie walked around inside the apartment, he felt a strange relief. Here he didn't have to be the thin white duke. Here he could just be David. But the first days weren't easy. Bowie was going through cocaine withdrawal, and the symptoms were severe. Shaking, sweating, insomnia, depression. Iggy Pop was going through similar processes because he was also trying to kick drug addiction. The two men supported each other. They'd wake up early in the mornings and ride bikes, pedaling through Berlin streets for hours. This simple activity was critical for both physical and mental recovery. Movement, fresh air, and anonymity, these were all part of the treatment. Berlin's atmosphere in 1976 was unique. The city still carried the scars of World War II. The Berlin Wall divided the city in two, and Cold War tension could be felt everywhere. But this tension, paradoxically, created a fertile environment for creativity. West Berlin was an island, isolated and strange, and this isolation created a magnetic pull for artists. Bowie and Iggy found a place for themselves in this bizarre city. In the first weeks, Bowie and Iggy lived like tourists. They went to museums, frequently visiting the Brücke Museum. German expressionist art deeply affected them both. They sat in small cafes and talked for hours. At night, they went to Berlin's underground bars. Nobody recognized them there, and this made them feel free for the first time in a long time. David would sometimes walk the streets in a simple jacket and hat, and nobody turned to look. This anonymous life was incredibly liberating after the constant surveillance and pressure of Los Angeles. David and Iggy's relationship in Berlin was complex but based on deep friendship and mutual support. Both were people who had hit bottom, experiencing major crises in their careers and personal lives. Iggy's band The Stooges had broken up, and he was dealing with serious drug problems. David was in the middle of the Nazi salute scandal and cocaine addiction. The two men clung to each other in Berlin. Their daily routine was simple but therapeutic. Morning bike rides after breakfast, museum or gallery visits in the afternoons. They usually made dinner at home. Since neither David nor Iggy were professional cooks, their meals were usually disasters. But this was a fun activity for them. Nights sometimes passed quietly. Sometimes they'd go out to explore Berlin's underground music scene. But everything wasn't always calm. The two men sometimes came up with crazy ideas in the middle of the night. Once at 3 in the morning, they decided to go to the Berlin Wall and try to climb it. Of course they failed and were nearly caught by East German soldiers. Another night, they went to one of Berlin's most dangerous bars and almost got into a fight. These kinds of moments showed they weren't fully healed yet, but they were also part of their struggle to hold on to life. David decided to help restart Iggy's solo career. This would be therapeutic for both Iggy and himself. Together they started making the Idiot album. David was producing, Iggy was writing songs and performing. This collaboration was critical for both of them. because creativity was an important part of healing. Spending time in the studio was a perfect way to not think about drugs. Hansa Studios was a legendary studio located in Berlin's Kreuzberg district, just a few meters from the Berlin Wall. Large, industrial-looking, cold but acoustically perfect. From the studio's windows, you could see the wall and East Berlin beyond. This view was a constant reminder for David: division, isolation, but also potential unity and hope. When David started working at Hansa, he knew he wanted to make completely different music. After the Station to Station album, he wanted to move away from traditional rock and pop formats. He was looking for something more experimental, more ambient, more emotionally distant, yet paradoxically deeper. And at this point, Brian Eno entered the picture. Brian Eno was an experimental musician who had previously worked as a keyboardist in Roxy Music, then started a solo career. He was one of the pioneers of the ambient music genre and was doing innovative work in electronic music. David had been following Eno's approach with admiration and wanted to work with him on the Berlin project. Eno accepted David's invitation and came to Berlin in the fall of 1976. The chemistry between the two men was immediately apparent. Eno's experimental approach and David's emotional depth created a perfect combination. Their working method in the studio wasn't traditional. Sometimes they'd just experiment with sounds for hours. They'd use Eno's famous oblique strategies cards. These cards contained random instructions designed to overcome creative blocks. A card might say, for example, "Honor thy error as a hidden intention," and this could change the entire approach for the session. David's working days at Hansa were intense, but no longer like the chaotic, cocaine-fueled sessions in Los Angeles. He'd come to the studio in the mornings, work until lunch, rest for a while, then continue until evening. Cocaine use had almost stopped. Sometimes he still craved it but resisted, focused on the music. When the Low album was completed in early 1977, RCA Records executives were horrified. This album didn't conform to any commercial standards. The first half consisted of short, fragmented songs with minimal lyrics. The second half was entirely instrumental, ambient pieces. No pop singles, no radio-friendly hits, lyrics minimal and incomprehensible. How will this sell? They asked in panic. But Low's lack of commercial appeal was its real value. This album was a direct reflection of David's mental state. The song's sound and vision described sensory deprivation and the recovery process from drugs, always crashing in the same car, represented repeating error patterns and addiction. Be My Wife was the desperate cry of loneliness and searching for connection. The instrumentals in the album's second half told an even deeper story. Warszawa was inspired by a strange train journey David and Iggy had taken to Warsaw. The song's ambient, almost mournful atmosphere reflected the isolation of Eastern Europe during the Cold War. Art Decade was about Berlin's own history and division. Weeping Wall literally represented the Berlin Wall. When Low came out, critics were divided. Some called it genius, some called it commercial suicide. But the album eventually achieved cult status and was recognized as one of music history's most influential albums. Post-punk, new wave, electronic music, all of these were influenced by Low. For David, Low's importance was much deeper than commercial success. This album was his therapy. Every note was part of the healing process. While making the album, David transformed his own pain, confusion and searching into music, and this process saved him. After Low, David immediately started the next project. He didn't want to lose momentum because creativity kept him going. In mid-1977, again at Hansa Studios, again with Brian Eno, work began on the Heroes album. But this time the atmosphere was different. David was stronger now, more stable, more hopeful. The Heroes album was more accessible than Low, but still experimental. And at the center of the album was perhaps the most iconic song of David's career, Heroes. The story of this song is both beautiful and tragic. David had seen a couple kissing by the Berlin Wall from Hansa Studios' window. This couple met there every day, spending a few minutes together in the shadow of the wall. Maybe one from the east, one from the west, maybe just two people looking for love in a divided world. This image deeply affected David. The Heroes song was the story of this couple, but it also had a much more universal message. We can be heroes just for one day. We can be heroes just for one day. This sentence contained both hopelessness and hope. Heroism wasn't permanent, but it was possible for a moment, and maybe a moment was enough. The recording process of the song is also legendary. David recorded his vocals with a special technique. He put the microphone in the middle of the studio and sang from a distance. In the chorus, he delivered a vocal performance that went up a full octave and almost screamed. This performance was the perfect mix of desperation and hope. When the Heroes album came out, it was better received. It still wasn't quite mainstream, but it resonated strongly among critics and fans. And the Heroes song eventually became an anthem, not just David's, but an anthem for an entire era. When the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, David sang Heroes there, and thousands of people joined in tears. By 1978, David was in much better shape. Cocaine addiction was behind him. His mental health had improved. His creativity was at its peak. But his time in Berlin was ending. The city had healed him, but now he felt the need to move, see new places, have new experiences. The Lodger album was the final piece of the Berlin Trilogy, but it actually wasn't fully recorded in Berlin. David, Brian Eno, and the musicians worked at Hansa Studios in Switzerland. But the album's spirit was still in Berlin: experimentation, searching, transformation. Lodger was a more mobile, more rhythmic, more world music-influenced album. African Night Flight combined African rhythms with experimental electronics. Yassassin was inspired by Turkish music. Boys Keep Swinging questioned gender roles. The album showed David's expanding perspective and regained curiosity. Lodger was more commercially successful than the previous two albums, but still not mainstream. And for David, this was important. The Berlin Trilogy was never made for commercial success. These three albums were David's self-rescue project. And this project was successfully completed. By the end of 1979, David decided to leave Berlin. For 3 years, that city had been his home, healing him, artistically rebirthing him. But now it was time to return to the world. David moved to Switzerland, a calmer, more luxurious life, but still maintaining Berlin's simplicity. The Berlin experience had permanently changed David. He was no longer the old David Bowie, more mature, more balanced, more conscious. He'd kicked cocaine addiction, faced the shame of the Nazi salute scandal, moved away from dangerous characters like Ziggy and Duke. Now he could just be David. In 1980, he released the Scary Monsters album. This album combined the Berlin Trilogy's experimentalism with a more accessible format. The song, Ashes to Ashes, was a continuation of his 1969 song Space Oddity, but much darker and more mature. Major Tom was no longer a lost astronaut, but a drug addict. This song was David's reckoning with his own past. The impact of the Berlin years wasn't limited to David's own music. Low, Heroes, and Lodger influenced an entire generation of musicians. Post-punk groups Joy Division, Bauhaus, Susie and the Banshees all drew inspiration from the Berlin Trilogy. New wave artists Gary Newman, Depeche Mode, they also followed David's experimentalism during his Berlin period. The Berlin Trilogy's role in the development of electronic music is undeniable. In Berlin, David didn't just save himself, he saved Iggy Pop too. The two men had hit bottom together and climbed out together. David's support for Iggy wasn't just friendship, it was a mutual survival strategy. The Idiot and Lust for Life albums restarted Iggy's career. Lust for Life was especially important. The album's title track became the anthem of recovery and returning to life. The song was inspired by David and Iggy's daily routines in Berlin: morning runs, bike rides, simple but satisfying life. The lyrics, "I'm worth $1 million in prizes," spoke to the value of survival. David and Iggy's friendship in Berlin is one of rock history's most beautiful stories. Two broken men, holding on to each other, saved themselves in one of the world's strangest cities. This story shows the power of friendship, the healing effect of art, and that second chances are possible. Brian Eno's collaboration with David wasn't limited to just 3 albums. Eno's experimental approach and oblique strategies methodology permanently changed David's understanding of creativity. Eno taught David this: mistakes are valuable, coincidences are valuable, loss of control is valuable. This philosophy shaped David's later career. He no longer tried to plan everything, control everything. He allowed the natural flow of the creative process. This approach showed itself even in pop albums like Let's Dance, controlled chaos, planned spontaneity. Eno and David's friendship also continued after Berlin. For years they influenced each other, collaborated, contributed to each other's projects. Eno returned as producer on David's Outside album. The creative chemistry between the two men never disappeared. The Berlin Trilogy's place in music history is undeniable. These 3 albums expanded rock music's boundaries, contributed to the development of electronic and ambient music, influenced the post-punk movement, but more importantly, the Berlin Trilogy told a human story: collapse, struggle, recovery, transformation. David's Berlin years showed that even in artists' darkest moments, the healing power of creativity exists. Music can be therapy, art can be salvation, and sometimes the most beautiful works are created in the hardest times. Today in Berlin, Hansa Studios still stands. Recording no longer happens there, but the building is preserved. The Berlin Wall came down, but from that legendary studio room's window at Hansa, you can still see traces of the old wall. And when you look out that window, you can imagine that couple in love that David Bowie saw in 1977. People trying to be heroes, just for one day. Berlin gave David Bowie a second life. After the Victoria Station scandal, after Los Angeles cocaine, after the Thin White Duke's darkness, Berlin gave him a chance to start over. A cold, grey, divided city embraced 2 destroyed rock stars and healed them. Low, Heroes, Lodger. These 3 albums aren't just music. They're sound recordings of a man's climb from his darkest pit. Every note, every song, every silent moment carries traces of David's battle with himself, with his past, with his demons. The Berlin Trilogy teaches us something important. Recovery is possible, transformation is possible, and sometimes to escape, you need to go very far from where you fell. For David, this place was Berlin, and Berlin never let him down, as he sang in 1977 in the Heroes song, "We can be heroes just for one day." David Bowie was a hero not just for one day, but for 3 years, a hero of self-rescue, and this heroic story will echo forever in music history.